Not to scream at you, but that usually works in getting everybody's attention. Hi, I'm Jesse Ruiz, Vice Chair of the Metropolitan Planning Council Board of Governors, and on behalf of everyone at MPC, and if I may, on behalf of ULI as well, I welcome you to our roundtable discussion this afternoon. As a partner here at Drinker, Biddle, and Reith in our Corporate and Securities Group, I'm excited to see the vision for a Cook County Land Bank moving forward. Given that my practice involves commercial transactions, real estate development, and equity investments in those bodies, this initiative will help remove barriers for both the private and public sector to operate successfully in the real estate market. I also want to acknowledge Drinker Biddle colleagues that lent time to the Urban Land Institute Technical Assistance Panel and will continue to support this effort going forward. Finally, thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed the discussion.
Good afternoon. Cindy McSherry. I'm the Executive Director for ULI Chicago, and on behalf of ULI as well as MPC, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. This is going to be just a great conversation. I'd also like to take just a few minutes to recognize Scott Goldstein, who was the chair of the Technical Assistance Panel that we put together in order to facilitate this conversation and ultimately get to at least the finish line or the starting line, I'm not sure which. I'd also like to recognize or at least make mention of the ULI members that are in the audience who gave and volunteered a great deal of time and energy on this technical assistance panel. So for those of you that are in the room, I thank you very much. Mary Sue?
Let me add my words of welcome. I'm Mary Sue Barrett, President of the Metropolitan Planning Council, and we are just thrilled to be teaming up with ULI Chicago to host today's roundtable. And by the attendance of almost 250 of you here today, clearly there's just a little bit of interest in learning together. So the Metropolitan Planning Council has been around for almost 80 years, and our business is solutions to the challenges facing our region: economic, environmental, quality of life, all the things that, when they're working well, makes this a great place to live and do business, and when they're not, we all pay a price. So we like to be on the positive end of the solutions, and we can't do that without great partners across organizations and government and community organizations. Roundtables is one of the tactics that we use to help educate people about the cost of doing nothing, some of the ideas out there from around the country, as well as solutions that can be applied to our challenges here. Our panel is now fully here. Welcome, President Preckwinkle. It's terrific timing.
Just in the nick of time.
So we do roundtables to engage all of you. So I hope that today you are here to learn, but also hopefully to spark your interest in participating going forward. I want to give a special thanks not only to Cindy McSherry and the ULI Chicago team, but also Joanna Trotter and Brianne Gala from Metropolitan Planning Council, who have been instrumental to working on this issue and to planning today's event. A couple of quick announcements as we get started. Today's event is being recorded in partnership with our National Public Radio affiliate WBEZ Chicago Amplified. We also are recording this for web rebroadcasting, so if you know people who are not able to join us here today but want to learn and catch the content, there'll be several opportunities to do that in the future. As part of your reminder email, you also got a link to several reports that informed this process. So please download those pieces of information. We have a few, but not many, hard copies of the report of the Cook County Land Bank Advisory Committee here today, but that's also in the link, as is the ULI Technical Assistance Panel report. Drinker, Biddle, and Reith, thank you for hosting this. We have space at MPC's Conference Center for less than half of the number of people who are here today. And we just had a sixth sense that this was a topic that was going to require more space. So thank you to Jesse and also his colleague Pam Walter, who is an honorary board member of MPC and former chair, for their long time partnership with us. So today's topic is an interesting and urgent issue facing our community, not unique to Cook County. Of course, the weak or anemic recovery has a lot to do with structural challenges, one of which is the abandonment blight and vacancy that exerts a price, not only on housing values, that's the way we often talk about it, but also in terms of job creation, in terms of crime, in terms of economic development that is stymied. And of course, that affects our bottom line prospects, but also our attractiveness of our neighborhoods. So the 4 panelists assembled today will help us learn about how the tool of a land bank can turn around a problem and turn it into an asset, distressed properties. Last end of the summer, President Preckwinkle called me up and asked if I would chair this Land Bank Advisory Committee, and I was really pleased to accept the challenge. It was a big one, and many of the folks here in the room were involved in some way. They were interviewees with ULI on the technical assistance panel. They served on the TAP or the advisory committee or the working group or a resource to us. So thank you, huge thank you. We accomplished a huge amount in less than 90 days, and you'll hear in a moment about the progress that's been made quite quickly. What you are about to learn is really the ground floor of an effort that's important for us to know about together so that we can maximize the potential. What I'm going to do is a brief introduction. You've also got bios on the sheet in front of you, so you can look for more information at your sheet. But I will quickly introduce the 4 panelists, and then I will turn to them in order for about 10 minutes each. And if we stay on schedule, and I pledge to do that, we will have a full half hour for your questions. You have an index card on your seat, so as you're listening to the 4 presentations and the content that they cover, please do jot down a question. We'll be collecting those throughout our discussion, and I'll be facilitating that at the tail end so that we get to as many as we can. So I'm going to start closest to me with President Preckwinkle. President Preckwinkle is someone I've had the pleasure of working with for quite some time. I, in the past, worked in city government, and many of you know she was an alderman for 19 years of the 4th Ward. She has been Cook County Board President since November of 2010, and some would say expectations would have been exceeded if she just got Cook County government back to competency. She has done much, much, much more. So the bar has been set high. Those of you who know Tony know she's got an extremely high energy level, high quality expectations, and she has inspired her partners inside and outside of government to rise to the occasion. So it's not just about not screwing up, it's about doing good and seizing the moment, and that's very much what this land bank is about. There is an urgency. Whether it's hospitals or corrections or the city-county collaboration on workforce housing or vacant property, what I have seen again and again is that President Preckwinkle asks for the best minds and the best ideas to come together. When I asked her what she wanted out of this process, she said, no preconceived expectations, just do the homework and come up with the best recommendation. And we appreciated that and tried to take that challenge seriously. After President Preckwinkle, we will hear from Scott Goldstein. Scott is principal of Tesca Associates, which is an Evanston-based full-service planning firm. This is a bit of a homecoming for Scott. Proud to call him a former colleague, where he was vice president at the Metropolitan Planning Council for quite some years. And both there and in his current work at Tesca, his work involves the really interesting intersection between community development and economic development and livability. So people call on Scott to facilitate planning efforts really all across the Chicagoland region to bring together the various voices, and no surprise, that's why he was an ideal chair for the Urban Land Institute Technical Assistance Panel. He's very active with ULI. He chairs their Public Policy Committee, and the Technical Assistance Panel is a perfected tool that ULI uses all around the globe, but Chicago is particularly good at it. So when someone is asked to chair it, it's a really big deal. And Scott took the mission of ULI, responsible stewardship of land, and really brought it to life with this technical assistance panel that he'll tell you about the contribution that they made to this outcome. Joining us from Ohio is Jim Rokakis. Jim was part of the ULI Technical Assistance Panel, and people describe him as a driving force behind land banks really around the country, and particularly in Ohio. He wears several hats. A couple of them are vice president of the Western Reserve Land Conservancy, and he's also a director of the Thriving Communities Institute. His national expertise on land banks comes from having helped establish 15 county land banks in Ohio, and he works with their state capital in Columbus and in Washington, D.C. to raise funds for land banks generally and for distressed properties. Jim helped create the Cleveland Cuyahoga County Land Bank, which was one of the key models that was especially helpful for us in this process. And he helped write state legislation, which helped streamline the foreclosure process in Ohio. And of the $98 million that the Ohio Attorney General had to spend on distressed properties, he helped access $75 million of that for demolition. That's one of the reasons why 60 Minutes interviewed him about the importance of demolition as part of our recovery strategy to reclaim and repurpose land in distressed areas. Our fourth panelist is Commissioner Bridget Gaynor, another person I'm proud to have a long relationship with. Bridget, over 20 years, has worked in the private sector, in the public sector, and with non-for-profit organizations, and she also is a high-energy person. That contribution was instrumental to this process. She was elected to the county board in 2009 and represents an area that is the North Lakefront and the Northwest Side. What she has done through the years, whether it was starting a community organization in Edgewater or working with Aon on strategic initiatives, is to bring great minds that don't talk together to understand their common interests, and then that pragmatism, again, really is a commonality across this panel. So since being on the county board, Commissioner Gaynor has worked on a host of issues, but has really focused in as one of her priorities on vacant land. Back in 2011, helped create the momentum for the county's land bank, the county's vacant building ordinance, and now for the land bank ordinance. And we're delighted that she's put so much effort into this initiative. So I'm going to kick it off with you, President Preckwinkle. And my question is a stage setter question. You thought a lot about taking this on among the many challenges that you might take on. And we'd like to hear a little bit about why. Why did you feel that this was a critical issue and that a land bank might be a necessary tool to help you achieve your vision and the potential for Cook County?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary Sue. I appreciate the invitation to come today, and I'm very grateful to you for your leadership in our advisory group that kind of set the stage for our land bank authority. Cook County is an interesting place. It has 5.3 million people. It has, I don't know, more than 121 municipalities, cities, towns, and villages. And there's real uneven development across the county. There's some parts that have been booming, and other parts that have been struggling for a very long time, particularly in the Southland, struggling for decades. So we looked at the opportunities for economic revitalization, and the Land Bank Authority seemed to be an obvious one. We put together a group to kind of advise us on how to proceed, and I'm very grateful to all of you in this audience who participated. I want to acknowledge the good work that Commissioner Gaynor has done on this issue in particular. She's been a leader in the Board of Commissioners as we've looked at economic revitalization and how a land bank might contribute to that. We've spent more than a year working with all of the interested parties, the banks, realtors, affordable housing advocates, and city and suburban leaders around this issue to come to the point where we are today. We're trying to address some of the problems that have cropped up in communities in recent years, as well as longstanding economic stagnation in other parts of the county. I understand that Woodstock Institute put out a study yesterday, and let me share a little bit of the results of that. The Institute found that there were nearly 22,000 foreclosure filings. Do you mind if I stand up?
Not at all. In fact, I think that microphone's not projecting the way it should be, so please feel free to use this.
Okay, so this is better, huh? I couldn't hear myself very well, so I figured you couldn't hear me either. So I was talking about the Woodstock Institute study, and the Institute found there were nearly 22,000 foreclosure filings in Cook County in 2012. That's a modest increase over 2011, about a 1.3% increase. There's some good news. In suburban Cook County, there have been a decrease in foreclosures in Northwest and suburban Cook. So a decrease there, but still a modest increase over the previous year. What's really troubling is that 10% of the housing units in Cook County are vacant. 10%. That's profoundly disturbing, and it's a result of a report that was released last year by our Cook County Land Bank Advisory Committee. It also found that 85,000 foreclosure cases are pending in circuit court. 85,000. This gives you an idea of the magnitude of the problem we're addressing, and it's why we created the Cook County Land Bank Authority, which will be the largest land bank in the country. Across the United States, land banks have proven to be an effective tool to reverse the downward cycle of decline and decay. More than 80 local units of government in 23 states have created land banks to turn vacant land from a liability into an asset. In the state of Illinois, we'll have 2 land banks, one in South Suburban Cook and one for the county as a whole, and we intend to work very closely with the South Suburban Cook Land Bank. Our land bank is going to be focused on acquiring vacant and abandoned properties and redeveloping them with the goal of putting them back on the tax rolls. The first objective is to work with the communities that are hit hardest by the crisis. We want to address immediate needs. We see our authority as an intervention tool. It may not halt foreclosures, but we hope that it will at least slow the decline. We want to remove redevelopment barriers and jumpstart economic development. You know, when I was alderman of the 4th Ward in the 1990s and in 2000, the city had what we called a tax reactivation program to make non-cash bids and tax sales and basically develop an inventory of vacant land for future development when the economy improved. And when I worked with the folks in the Department of Planning, I said, you know, take everything in the 4th Ward. Take everything, so that we will have a mass of properties. Hopefully, we can aggregate them and clean them up in whatever way we need to, so that they'll be available for development, as I said, when the economy improves. And we were very successful in doing that in the early 90s, and as the economy improved in the later 90s and the early part of the first decade of the 21st century, we had a significant number of parcels to make available to developers, and some of them at significant scale. As County Board President, I've seen firsthand how many municipalities struggle to return vacant properties back to productive use. They don't have a Department of Planning, as the city of Chicago does, that has dozens and dozens of people who are working on this. They lack the resources to put abandoned property back in the hands of private owners who will develop the properties and pay taxes. Activities such as land acquisition, erasing back taxes, and clearing title are costly and complicated. From my own experience in the city, it sometimes took years for us to do that. But it was time well spent, it was resources well spent, because as I said, then we had land available for future development. These processes are complicated, and they challenge the abilities of even the most sophisticated and well-funded municipalities. Financially strapped communities, and we have many of those in Cook County, find this process insurmountable. That's why a land bank authority will work alongside of municipalities to pursue their goals. On Tuesday, I submitted the names of the Board of Directors of the Cook County Land Bank Authority. This was the first step for us in a process of applying for state support for our Land Bank Authority. I saw a diverse group of professionals with expertise in a variety of fields, including housing, open space, real estate, and commercial development, to ensure that our Land Bank Authority can be nimble in responding to market demands. We've been awarded, and I'm very grateful, a $149,000 grant from the Cyril Funds at the Chicago Community Trust to underwrite startup activities at our Land Bank Authority, including recruiting staff, developing a business plan, creating programs and operating policies and procedures, and building a website. The grant also secured the cost of technical assistance to be provided by the Center for Community Progress, which is the premier land bank expert in the country. The function of the bank is expected to evolve over time, beginning with the acquisition of abandoned properties to try to stop declining home values and neighborhood blight. The ultimate goal, of course, is for this entity to be self-sustaining and to engage in redevelopment projects on its own. You know, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I've tried to be a good example and talk less than 10 minutes so we have plenty of time for questions. But I really appreciate the good work that MPC has done in putting this together. And again, I want to thank Bridget Gaynor for her good work in this arena as well. Thank you very much.
We will also bring the other panelists up to the podium because we want to make sure you don't miss a word. Again, if you have a question on an index card, pass it to the middle, and my colleagues Brianne and Joanna will walk up and down on occasion to pick those up. So, President Preckwinkle, that was a great kickoff for discussing why this issue is going to drag down the county if we did nothing and could help communities get back in the driver's seat as in partnership with Cook County. So we obviously are excited about the potential, and I know MPC pledges to be involved every step of the way. I also want to commend you for the tone you set for the advisory committee. I think it has something to do with why we're so quickly where we are today, and it's something we ought to learn from for other processes. You know, you got to do your homework. You got to reach out and open up the process and involve lots and lots of people, and that's a big burden. But your staff, Herman Brewer, Maria Choca Urban, Stephanie Melito, and others patiently helped us through that process. And the advisory committee really stepped up and put the time in. We could not have done our work if we didn't have the assistance of a working group of folks, people from the MacArthur Foundation, business and professional people for the public interest, the Chicagoland Realtors. All of these institutions said, this is important. We don't want to be on the outside complaining about an outcome later. We want to participate. So every single one of these organizations and the mayors, as President Preckwinkle mentioned, this tool is in service of local communities' plans to fill capacity gaps. So the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, South Suburban Mayors and Managers, and others were really critical. And we're lucky we have actually 3 mayors in the audience with us today. There is indicative of the partnership potential going forward. From Barrington, Karen Darch. From Oak Park, David Pope. From Riverside, Michael Gorman. Each of these are innovators within their own communities, but also have stepped up into leadership roles with CMAP, with their Council of Government, with the Mayor's Caucus. So thank you to the 3 of you and the colleagues we know that you will help us engage. So when we started this process as an advisory committee in October, we were a bit daunted by the timetable that was set, but up stepped Urban Land Institute and their technical assistance panel. So I want to ask Scott to help us briefly by describing the process that ULI also uniquely uses, and why the private sector, why the real estate community is particularly interested in this being a success. Thanks, Scott.
The short answer is yes. It is critical, and we'll explain about that in a minute. But it does feel like coming home. Less than a year ago, maybe about 9 months ago, we were moderating a panel. Commissioner Gaynor, President Preckwinkle's successor, another MPC alum, Alderman William Burns, and Lawrence Grisham. And we were talking about a variety of issues. And Commissioner Gaynor was talking about the idea of a land bank. And the conversation, I think we sealed the deal in this corner here that we were going to do a tap at some point, and that happened. And it is record time for a structural issue like this, creating a new tool countywide, essentially a regional tool, in about 6 months is pretty impressive. And I was saying to Commissioner Gaynor, I'll say to the President, the final ordinance is a real land bank. It's not something that is sort of like it, but not really. It is a real land bank, and so we're very happy about that. ULI Chicago, Cindy McSherry mentioned, has over 1,000 members in the Chicago region, and certainly has probably the most active technical assistance program in the country. We've won various awards, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. What the point was that volunteers came together and devoted, we say 2 days, but it's really a lot more than 2 days, because you really have to prepare in advance, and then we call on you and never let you go, right? Terry Frankevich is right there. And so we had an incredible group of people, and in fact, here today, Michael Brady I saw here from the Center for Community Progress. Karen Butler is here from Great Harbor Advisors. Jim Rockakis, our next speaker, came in to town for the panel. Jeff Smith is here from DePaul, and 5 or 6 others, who I might have missed someone in the audience here, spent the full 2 days, no cell phone calls, etc. Really, the first half of it was listening to many of you here today, interviewing small groups, workshops, evening session, there was a working session, really getting a tremendous amount of input in terms of what would really work in Cook County. There really was no single model in the country that exactly fit, because we have many markets in Cook County. And so it's not just about the foreclosure issue, it's also the economic development issue, we were told. It's about industrial development, it's about housing, it's about transit-oriented development, and most importantly, it's a tool that various municipalities could use to further the plans they have. And so we brought these 13 experts together for the 2-day period, and the work moved on from then. There is a written report, and we're so pleased that the advisory board that Mary Sue chaired really built on, improved some things, but also followed some of the very ideas that we were working on. In particular, we thought that a land bank was absolutely essential to assemble land for commercial, industrial, and residential development, stabilize communities through acquisition and disposition of key parcels, clear title to properties, strategically repurpose land and vacant buildings, support local priorities, and ensure that there is a countywide tool available for those communities in the county that wanted to take part in it. ULI presented the recommendations to the Cook County Land Bank Advisory Board that Mary Sue Barrett chaired, and we're very pleased that both the advisory board and the county board as a whole followed many of the ideas. Number one, that the Home Rule Authority of Cook County could be used to establish the land bank. But more important, so it needed to be part of government to have the authority that came along with this, but have the independence and have an independent board to direct policy. So in other words, it's very critical that every property isn't going to have to go back to the Cook County board. It needs to be acting quickly and nimbly in the private marketplace. And so we think that the ordinance that passed strikes that correct balance. It needed to have the ability to be exempt from property taxes. Those of you who are developers who know in that acquisition period, it can be quite costly, whether you're nonprofit or for-profit, to hold that property during that period of time. That's something that could be provided by municipalities right now, but could be much more efficiently provided through a Cook County land bank. Have the ability to extinguish special assessments, the ability to finance acquisition and disposition of properties, rehabilitate properties, and get involved if needed to make sure that that development happens. Very importantly, ULI Chicago thought it was important that the land bank really further the goals set by local communities and set by the region as a whole, rather become yet another entity trying to figure out planning in the region. So there's an important distinction there. From a developer's point of view, going back to Mary Sue's question, from a private sector point of view, the land bank can provide predictability. Virtually all complex projects need some type of public-private partnership. This could be a great opportunity for that developer to know what costs they're going to have and be able to ascertain what approvals they're going to get and have the land bank be at the table to help that project move forward. I've seen that firsthand. I do some work in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They have a region-wide land bank. Has been extremely effective at supporting transit-oriented development along the light rail that they are buying, for example. And so the private sector is working with nonprofits, is working with local governments, is working across parties, and they've got the state capital in 2 cities and several counties and municipalities. The land bank is a technical tool to make that redevelopment happen. The other thing about being strategic is many parcels don't have any value. And it doesn't make sense to acquire properties throughout an area as large as Cook County without that strategy in place. And so there are, we heard about triangular lots you can't build on and parcels and banks willing to give large portfolios of property. And so we put up a caution mark on that to make sure that the land bank proves successful and is able to hold and transfer those properties to tax-paying purposes in the future. Similarly, the disposition process needs to be consistent and transparent, respect local context, include negotiated sales, and target qualified purchasers that have the capacity to undertake redevelopment. It doesn't help if property came out of foreclosure, the land bank acquires it, and then it goes back to auction to other developers who are not able or that don't have a plan to make that happen, don't have the capacity to make it happen. So parallel to this is how do we get the resources to help the capacity, particularly in the nonprofit sector, to be able to take on those projects. Concluding my remarks, I want to thank President Preckwinkle and Commissioner Gaynor in particular for asking us and giving us the opportunity to do the panel. We are committed to continue to work with you. We have a lot of resources within the organization. We want to make sure you take advantage of that. And we are so happy that the ordinance passed so quickly and that the board is going to county board vote. So we're very pleased about that and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. One of the things we're excited about is that the international meeting of ULI this fall is taking place in Chicago. So if we need a little bit more deadline pressure, there's another one where we want to actually move this land bank to a point where there's something to talk about by the time folks from around the world are descending here, potential investors. There's a lot of good stories to tell, and this is hopefully going to be part of that momentum. Scott, I heard you say a few things that were really important. Nimble, responsive, removing market barriers, power of government, intertwined with independence. And I think that the land bank in Cook County is poised to achieve each one of those. But I do want us to keep those in mind. Jim Rackauckas is next. And from your experience, Jim, with the Cuyahoga Land Bank, we looked a lot at that example. You've come to know our challenges in Chicago. Every place is a bit unique, but I think there's some things for us to learn from your multiple experiences in Ohio. There's some similarities between what you've helped start up and what we're poised to do here. Countywide scale, partnerships with local municipalities, and being a master of your own destiny. In other words, things don't default to the land bank. You actually get to target and prioritize. There are also differences, though, with the legislation that you are operating under, and we want to learn from those similarities and differences. So please help us come up to the podium and describe your experience, and I hope you'll also have a few minutes to share some of your advocacy efforts about new tools. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Thank you, and let me first tell you how impressed I am by the intelligence and the good planning I've seen here with Metropolitan Planning Council and with ULI and with Commissioner Gaynor. I enjoyed working with staff member Katie. I expected that in Chicago, but I think just because I expected it doesn't mean that bad politics can't get in the way of good policy, and I have not seen that. So I tell you, I'm really impressed by what I've seen. A little bit about our structure. There's some similarities, some dissimilarities, but in Cuyahoga County, this is a state law that was passed in December of 2008. The initial bill was supposed to be an all-Ohio bill, but the legislature there said, nope, we don't trust it. We realize you have special challenges in Cleveland, so it'll be a Cuyahoga County-only bill. So the bill has been changed now twice. It now allows any county over 60,000 in population. There's a bill underway that will actually remove that barrier so every county in the state will be eligible. But the Cuyahoga County Land Realization Corporation, also known as the County Land Bank, is approved by the county commissioners, was incorporated by the county treasurer. That was me back in 2009. It's a separate nonprofit government purposed entity designed to be nimble, as you pointed out, Scott, agile and be able to move quickly, governed by a board of directors. Now, our board of directors, statutory, consists of the 2 county commissioners, the county treasurer, a representative of the largest city, township representatives. Townships are very powerful in Ohio. They make up about 59% of the population. So there are township representatives on these boards as well. So those are the 5 board members, but it can actually be a 7 or 9 member board. If you get to that larger number, you have to bring in somebody on with real estate experience. Our mission is not that dissimilar from your mission, to strategically acquire properties, to return them to productive use, to reduce blight, to increase property values, support community goals, and improve the quality of life for county residents. Even though Cook is about 5 times larger than Cuyahoga County, I see a lot of similarities. Clearly, the one big difference is just how much stronger Cook County is as a county and this region as a region. You have to know that no state has been more devastated by the foreclosure crisis than Ohio, and no city more devastated than Cleveland. Cleveland had almost 500,000 people in 2000. We're at about 370,000 now, and while it was a declining community then, You have to know it was the foreclosure crisis that put us over the edge. Cleveland led the country between 2000 and 2006 in foreclosures. It was just awful. So the functions, and I can't stress this first one enough, to be able to clean toxic titles. It's the most important tool I think land banks have. The ability, now we have it through statute, and I understand you have it here through intergovernmental agreements, but the point is critical. If you want to do any kind of development, you want to be able to move quickly, to assemble pieces of property, for whatever the reason, your inability to clean the title can actually be fatal to what you're doing. When I was a city councilman in Cleveland, we were doing a small shopping center in a kind of a distressed area of Cleveland I represented. It took us 12 years to do it, and I'm going to tell you that 7 of those 12 years were revolved around toxic titles where there were missing heirs and liens and folks who had claims to the property. It was a mess. So the ability to do that is critical. We also gained control of property quickly for demolition. Again, not as big an issue here. I've talked to your building commissioner, County, Rich Minacchio, and I think your number of properties condemned in waiting demolition in this county is, I think, about half of the number of properties in Cuyahoga County. So for us, it's a critical tool. Rehabilitation is also very important. It depends on the neighborhood and the cost of the rehab. Sale to new and private owners. You'll see the numbers here in a minute. A lot of what we do is not that complicated. We often take a piece of property and simply split it and deed it to adjoining property owners. In particular cases where property owners have been suffering for years with a vacant, distressed property that's destroyed their property values, we simply give it to them. Now, some of the land banks are a little more creative. There's one in Erie County that has a creative program called Mow to Own. And if you mow the grass for 2 years, you get to keep the property. So the neat thing about that, you have the palette here in Cook County is blank. It's a nice canvas. You get to paint any way you want. Creative reuse, you often hear about gardening, green space, stormwater management, replanting the urban forest, and other innovative and ecological purposes. Again, I think we're going to have a lot more vacant land than you do in Cook County. We were incorporated in June of '09. I chaired the board in a statutory capacity. We really didn't get into business really until about the last quarter of 2009. And here are the numbers. Since that time, we've acquired 2,862 properties. We've disposed of 1,599 properties. We've rehabbed 530 through a deed and escrow problem. Not a problem, it's a program. We had a rush of people. You going to let me know in time? Okay. We had a rush of people that approached the land bank. This was a get-rich-quick scheme. Oh, great, this is the place we're going to pick up property for $1. We weren't that stupid. A number of us on the board had been members of the Cleveland City Council. We understood the flipping game. You don't get a piece of property. You might get it for $1, but you will not get the deed until there's a certificate of occupancy. So we hold that deed in escrow. We give you 9 months, and if you don't do it, you don't get the property. We have done some rehabbing in-house. Not a good idea. Of the 29 we've rehabbed, we've been able to sell 12. We're still sitting, we're still sitting on the other 17. 1,506 demolitions so far. Because of the robo-signing money, this number is likely to double by the early part of 2014. I can't tell you how much we appreciate the efforts of our Attorney General. That $75 million that he gave us for demolition of land banks in Ohio required a match, so the 75 is actually going to produce $120 million in demolition in a state with about 100,000 condemned properties awaiting demolition, and there's 1,263 properties in the current inventory. Challenges, and we've talked about this at the TAP, and you know it, you really need to develop a dedicated revenue stream. In Ohio, we take half of the penalty on a delinquent tax bill and divert it to the land bank, typically a 10% penalty. So if it's a $1,000 tax bill, they pay $1,100, $50 or half of the penalty is diverted to the land bank in Cuyahoga County. That's a stream of about $6.6 million. Strategic plan is critical. You're going to find early on your demand will outstrip your ability. You're going to be hearing from aldermen. You're going to be hearing from mayors, with all due respect to the mayors here. You're going to be hearing from council people in some of these suburban communities. You're just going to have to really be strategic, and you really can't be all things to all people. As the old saying goes, if you try to be all things to all people, you're going to be nothing for anybody. So that's really critical. I think you have to establish yourself as a go-to partner for the GSEs and banks. We met with some of Senator Durbin's staff yesterday. We had an arrangement in Cuyahoga County where HUD and Fannie was transferring all low-value properties directly to the Cuyahoga County Land Bank. Not surprisingly, about 3 months ago, they discontinued that practice. HUD is back in the business now, flipping properties out to people all over the country for $500. They claim they're doing it under pressure from Congress. and the fact that they have to maximize their revenue streams to make up for those losses. It's really bad public policy. HUD has been an awful neighbor. I'm sure they haven't been a great neighbor here either. We need to work on congressmen and our senators to see if we can't get them to get some sense back into their heads about how they're going to deal with these properties. And you need to partner on this last one with everybody in the real estate market. Real estate, I know that early on the real estate community was in opposition to your efforts. They need not to be. This is the best thing that ever happened to them. Banks, servicers, community groups. It's not a panacea, but it's a valuable tool, and it's one that they have to take advantage of. So quickly, legislative advocacy, demolition funding. I'm obviously a one-trick pony when it comes to demo. It was the mayor of Youngstown who, when I was talking about why they needed a land bank, turned to me and cut me off and says, "You got money for demo?" And I said, "Well," and he said, "Stop." He said, "If you don't have money for demo, it's like giving me a new car with no gas. Looks good, doesn't take me anywhere." He said, "Find me money for demo." He was just that abrupt. So we found some money, but we need to find more. Hardest hit funds. $7.6 billion set aside by the Obama administration back in 2009 for mortgage foreclosure relief programs. Very little of that money has been spent. In Illinois, $445 million was set aside, and in 2.5 years, they spent less than 10% of it. Indiana had $221 million set aside. They spent about 3% of it. Ohio has the best expenditure rate in the country, and they spent about 18% of the $557 million. We're asking our congressional folks to consider just tweaking, right, Scott? Just a little tweak, and say that you can use it for mortgage relief and/or land banks, reclamation, demolition in states that are in the hardest hit fund program, and there are 18 of them. The money, by the way, if it's not used, is going to end up being returned to the Treasury. We think there's a good way to use it. We've put a bill in, House Resolution 4210, called the Restore Our Neighborhood Act, through a number of Congress people. It's going to create demolition tax credits, just as we have tax credits for affordable low-income housing and for other kinds of housing. That bill is back in the Congress, and we'll see where it goes. It's probably a tougher one. And the last one, and I'll be quick, is EPA. The EPA issue is a real problem. EPA and some of the more draconian rules they've adopted in December of 2010 are driving the cost of demolition up by 20 to 25%. And if demolition money is in such short supply, giving a quarter of it away to an EPA policy that we think can be adjusted and we can work with them on this makes good common sense, and it's one we have to work towards. And finally, I'd say it's a healthy community you have here. I know you've got tougher pockets, but we needed a land bank to survive. And I think the difference between a Cook County and a Cuyahoga County is we need it to survive. I think you can use it as a tool to thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really helpful, Jim. And you're right, Cook County is this amalgam. We are weak market, we are strong market, we're everything in between, and we need the Cook County Land Bank to function and be adaptable to those. You've got a sense of urgency from your experience as a local government and state government official, and we feel that here too. We could have waited for the kind of perfect moment legislatively or politically to act, but we didn't. And it's a real tribute to both President Prenkwinkle and our next speaker, Commissioner Gaynor, that we decided to go for it. There is a sense of urgency, and there might be other tools that we will need in the future, like the ones that Jim described. But in the meantime, let's get the ball rolling. We were able to seize the momentum and see so much progress fourth quarter into the start of this year because of all of those conversations that Commissioner Gaynor had with people painstakingly to build the interest and the buy-in. I wouldn't say the real estate community was opposed ever to this, but skeptical for sure. And so ULI's involvement was critical, and other associations like the Realtors was critical to be willing to listen and figure out how we found that common ground. Commissioner Gaynor, you've got that style of helping people find that common ground, and I hope that you'll help us understand how the land bank can be integrated into broader community revitalization efforts. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary Sue and MPC and Drinker Biddle for having us here. As Scott alluded, we were here about a year ago, and these forums are invaluable, so that's why I want to thank our host, because it gets everyone together and it starts to build that momentum. So I appreciate and very happy that we're here now having a successful conversation and conclusion about at least phase one. So President Preckwinkle set the stage for why we are in the situation that we need to have these innovative solutions, and I don't think that I could have had a better partner, or the county could have anyone that is more focused on this issue for the last at least 20 plus years of her career, this idea of community development and having to not wait until someone comes to you with a solution, but to really go out and go after it. And so both the president and Herman Brewer and Maria Choka-Urban from her staff and the others have been great as we've moved forward through this process. So I appreciate it and look forward to as we take the next steps. So while we know that all of the statistics of where we are, the enormous number of filings, the fact that those numbers have spiked in the last couple of years, all the things that means, there's the same number of foreclosure judges, 10 to 12, as there were 10 years ago when we had 15 to 20,000 filings. And so you end up with all of these kind of adverse effects. But I think it's helpful to understand when we talk about the land bank, which at least to us in Illinois is a new concept, is to understand how we got here and why did we come up with this solution as opposed to others. So as the president alluded to, and anyone who's a mayor or elected official or anyone who runs a community organization can attest to the fact that, 3 and 4 years ago, we started getting these calls from constituents who were going through foreclosure, receiving lots of letters at their house, not really knowing what to do, not understanding, does that mean they have to leave tomorrow? And so we started, my office and others, going through this process of helping people, getting on the phone with the servicer. If you've ever done that, it's an education, and it kind of inspires me whenever I think about this process. So, so we looked at a court mediation process. So first is like, how do we help the people who are hitting this head on in their homes and don't know what to do, and maybe have never walked into the court building in their life and now are going through in a way that's incredibly stressful. So we started the court program, working together with the president's office. We started a court mediation program that at least gives people some idea of what to do if they get a foreclosure filing. The next thing that we realized, based on this huge throughput problem in the court system where it's taking over 500 days to get title, even if 90% of the foreclosure filings are defaults, which one of the parties doesn't show up, it was creating a whole new class of victim, which is the people that were living on the block or next door to the home that was vacant. They might have been doing all the right things, but now you're living next to this vacant house, and depending on where it is and how long it's vacant, it not only immediately depresses your property values, but can also become a magnet for crime and a whole range of other unattractive activities. And more importantly, no one wants to live in a block that has 1 or 2 or 4 or half of the homes foreclosed or vacant, and no one should have to. So we looked at forming the vacant building ordinance, which we got tremendous support from our suburban allies, many of whom are in the room, and others who we worked on through the process, to look at saying, look, if you issued someone a mortgage and that person is no longer able to be found and not accountable, then you have to at least secure the building and cut the grass. So great, at least we can stem, again, kind of hit some of that bleeding right away. We got great cooperation from the banks, great cooperation from servicers in that process to write an ordinance that we did in collaboration with the city. The idea being, as we get more opt-in from the suburbs, that we end up with a uniform set of guidelines for Cook County. So if you are trying to do maintenance, we're happy to set a bar high, but at least it's consistent, and I think that not only increases accountability, but it also increases people's acceptance and actual manifestation of their obligation. But when you look at the point of having a vacant building ordinance, the natural question is, well, what's next? You can't regulate yourself out of this unhealthy part of the real estate economy that we're in certain communities that are suffering from more vacancy and foreclosure. You can't just put penalties on the banks. You can't keep bemoaning the fact that these mortgages shouldn't have been written in the first place. You have to look at a development-oriented solution. And to Jim's point, a lot of that is going to include demo, but a lot of it is going to include removing some of the obstacles that are within our control, title and back taxes, and kind of facilitating some of the administrative stuff that gets in the way of developments moving forward. And so the natural thought was, how do we take this to the next level? And as I mentioned, we were very much inspired by the president's focus on community development, not just in the 4th Ward, but looking at this regionally. And so we started looking around the country, and one of the things that came up was this idea of a land bank. And I see Marilyn Katz right here, and I have to give her credit for bringing this idea to us 2 years ago now, and with Dan Kildee, who used to run the Center for Community Progress, which all of us have learned an enormous amount from, and is now a member of Congress. So if you don't think the good guys ever get elected, you can be comfortable with that. So we looked at this issue of the land bank, and it was something that we saw most commonly, to Jim's point, in communities that had hit the foreclosure issue before we had. So they were a little bit ahead of us on the spectrum. So you saw at Cleveland. Dan Kildee, actually, I think you can call him the father of land banks, was from Flint, Michigan, and Genesee County. He was the treasurer, as was Jim. And they started looking at this issue. I mean, a lot of it is tied up into how the tax sale works with the vacant property, and it really looks to counties as the government entity that is really the steward of the tax base. And so when we look at our, at Cook County and our tax base, if one part of the tax base isn't performing, even if other parts start to say, well, it's picking up, it's looking better, prices are increasing, we still have this drag, besides all the other quality of life issues. So the land bank issue was really intriguing to us, and the first questions we asked, as Mary Sue kind of alluded to, is, do we need to go to Springfield with this, or can we do it with our own home rule authority? Because that to me was the most important thing. No knocks against Springfield, but you lose the speed in the equation. So the land bank had to offer us, I think, a couple of things that were really useful. And the land bank, as we have, and I appreciate Scott's comments on the ordinance, but I think the ordinance developed from the fact that there were probably, Herman, hundreds of conversations with people over the course of time. Suburbs and suburban mayors, and what was that going to mean to them? I mean, many of these suburbs don't have the home rule authority and powers that the city or the county, the city of Chicago or the county does. So their ability to do some of the things that are even within our control and difficult to do is very limited, if even not existent. Community organizations. What does the affordable housing community think of when they think about a land bank? What are their needs? Private developers, realtors, all of the whole spectrum of our real estate market. And it was a great experience to really hear from everybody and then have it kind of percolate up into turning into this actual piece of legislation. And I want to give ULI an enormous amount of credit. I had yet to be through the somewhat gauntlet of the TAP process, and I think we were initially surprised at its independence. Not that you don't want to manage these things, but just say you had a control issue. So, but they were fabulous, and they came up with wonderful, wonderful outcomes, and very much similar to the advisory board. And so they brought in all of these people. I mean, there was 80 to 100 people that were interviewed over this 2-day process before and after. And, the point that everyone got to have their say means that this thing that we will move forward that requires everyone's participation and acceptance to actually be successful, I think we have a better chance. And so I will just leave with the idea that the land bank brings things that are unique. And because one of the things we often heard is, why do you need a land bank? You already have all this stuff on the books. Why don't you just use the existing laws to enforce, which sounds, I always say it's similar to gun violence legislation, or, gun control arguments. But we say this is what the land bank does that's different. It has a clarity of purpose, which I don't think we can ever underestimate. We have lots of people that wake up and think, what do I do about affordable housing? And how do I get a nonprofit development going? And how am I going to address homelessness? And how do I make sure that the real estate market is healthy for realtors? But when you think about an entity that's whole focus is, what am I doing about vacancy and foreclosure in Cook County? Every day, that's their role, that's their job, whether it's the executive director, the staff, or the board, that's their entire focus. And I think that brings, that organizing principle helps us to move forward and address those issues. Because as I said before, we're starting to hear the percolation of positive news when it comes to home prices and sales, but that doesn't mean that there isn't this large tail of a market that still needs help. So the clarity of purpose, the independence, I think, is really important. And I think when you look at the people that the president appointed to the board, Mayor Emanuel also had an appointment on the board, that you'll see that it not only represents the real estate spectrum, but it brings people with a substantial career, either in the middle of their career or behind them, that kind of lets us know that these are serious people who are going to maintain the independence and the focus going forward. And the second, or the other issue is that it's self-sustaining. Ultimately, the president alluded to the fact that we received a grant from the Chicago Community Trust. We're also going to be making an application, as maybe many others in this room are, to the Attorney General's funds. We hope to get other funds in the future, but ultimately, and we are going to take the example of many of the land banks that exist around the country of there are revenue streams that we can go to, and all of this is kind of on the website and available to you, but we have to ultimately sing for our supper and make sure that we're focused on the right things in order to get the right revenue streams. And that brings me to market focused. We have to be focused to what moves things in the market. So if what we heard consistently from developers is clearing title, clearing taxes, holding land tax-free while I'm trying to do an acquisition are the things that we really need to get moving. We need to leverage the private market. As we've learned painfully over the last several years, government cannot get us out of this foreclosure crisis. We have to leverage, whether it's the realtors, whether it's the nonprofit developers, whoever else it is, we need to leverage that private market to move us forward. Otherwise, you can't fund, there isn't enough money to fund program after program after program. So in closing, right now our real estate market is broken. It's out of balance. There's a supply and demand mismatch, and that will eventually get fixed, whether it's through acquisition of portfolios by private equity firms, whether it's by just more people walking away from certain communities, but it's not necessarily going to be fixed in a way that is something that we want to see. We want to focus on not just fixing the market and not just creating a balance, but doing so in a way that increases the quality of life for the people all throughout the county. So thank you very much.
We are doing great. Thank you to the 4 panelists, both for the tremendous information, and to all of you who have gotten me a great jump start here on questions. We'll continue to collect them. Points for writing legibly. That's a big help. And what we've done is sort these with the help of Joanna Trotter and Brianne Gala into clusters. There are definitely some themes. And I'm going to start with an overarching one, which I'd invite all of the panelists that care to jump in on. And then I'll probably pick other ones initially directed to one panelist. If others want to jump in, feel free. But I'm not going to ask every person on the panel to weigh in on every question so we can get through more. So one of the common questions here is about next steps. So we know that there's a startup phase. The South Suburban Land Bank is a couple steps ahead. We've learned a lot from their experience, and the Cook County Land Bank has a gear up phase. What do each of you feel is the most important thing to focus on getting right in the next steps? There's governance, there's talent recruitment, there's funding, maybe there's a possibility of legislation, additional tools and powers. What's the most important next step?
From my perspective, I'm sorry, can people hear?
Let's try the other. I heard the other microphone. If it moves over, let's see if that works.
It doesn't work very well, that's all. All right, that much better?
That's
okay,
better.
Good. Partly it's because I'm an elected official, but I've always believed that leadership is critical, so trying to recruit good, talented people to help us with this enterprise, in my view, is the priority. Having good leadership in place is I think the critical fact, and we're going to ask our authority to put a lot of energy into that in the first 6 months, and our goal is to try to do a lot of the initial work in that 6-month period, and I'm hopeful that we'll be successful in that. But I want to correct my previous remarks. I didn't acknowledge Herman Brewer. Herman, do you want to stand? Herman's head of our Bureau of Economic Development. I don't know, is Maria Choke? Is Maria here?
Maria's right there.
Herman and Maria, thank you. Herman and Maria, that's much better. Herman and Maria Choke Urban worked very hard on this along with other staff in our Bureau of Economic Development. And to go back to Marilyn, I think it was a year ago, Marilyn, that you invited me to come to a conference in New Orleans on this very subject, vacant properties and land banks. So I want to acknowledge your foresight as well. But as I said, I'm always a big leader, a big proponent of the importance of leadership. So that's where we're going to start.
Well, organizational capacity is key. Faith for a variety of funders to step up. I mean, the concept that we all agree with is do it right. This is a big county. You have to have enough money, resources, and talented expertise in-house, as well as other folks to contract, to be able to set out a strategy. The next step is clear priorities. So the land bank purposefully is designed to be able to do just about anything, but I think communities will respond well if there are clear priorities for the first 2 years. For example, we said at ULI that brownfield development is probably extremely important, probably not a good thing in year 1. So I think that it's the land bank to set what those priorities are, but need to have successes, need to have very short-term as well as long-term successes. line up some development deals so that you can see something being built. Demolition is great, but we've got a strong market. We can get development to happen fairly quickly. If the politics move this quickly, let's get the private development community moving just as fast.
I agree with President Preckwinkle. I think the quality of staff you select over the next several months is critical. You have such a big tent here in Cook County. Ours is relatively small. It's going to be it's a tough job. They have the man or woman who takes this job and the staff that they assemble is critical. So I think you should take your time and look for the best possible help you can find.
I don't want to be repetitive, but I agree. I think that the executive director is the most important decision we will make, hands down, because that person, especially for a concept that's new, will be not just the validator of the concept, but they will have a variety of tasks at their disposal. And I think that we need to move quickly, and it needs to be somebody who understands and has the confidence on both finance and real estate, but also can maneuver all of the other, you know, the political and all these other things. So I think that's the number one decision we'll make.
So let's say we get all those things right. Really impressive board, top-notch staff, secured funding at a scale necessary to tackle the problem. There are a number of questions as we move from phase one into operational phase about the ripple effects. If we are successful, one of the things that will happen is that land values will increase. So there's obvious concerns, and it comes up in quite a few questions here about affordability. The land bank can be involved with development of a residential nature, of a retail, industrial, open space. We'll get to some questions about that in a moment. But specifically on this issue of preserving affordability in the surrounding area, it's a outcome, a problem we wish we would have, but if we're successful, we will have that problem, and there are serious concerns.
I think one of the, I didn't really go into the details, but one of the most important functions that land banks perform across the country, and I think probably one of the most important operational functions this land bank will execute, is the idea of intermediate use, and that gets into rental, which gets into affordability. You know, the land bank really is going to have three things that it can do. It can acquire land, it can have an intermediate use for that land, or it can dispose of the land. And the intermediate uses are far more nuanced and complicated than, you know, buying and selling is nuanced and complicated, but for example, running a single-family rental program is incredibly complicated. But one of the reasons that it was so important for us to have the land bank be countywide is not only because the foreclosure and vacancy is not a low-income community problem, it is really a regional problem. I believe it's the regional planning issue of this decade, and if we don't get it right, we'll have other issues. But you know, pulling together something like that, when you can go with the scale of something countywide and engage somebody who can bring property management skills and you know, and that type of resources to bear is easier when it's countywide. And looking at something across suburban jurisdictions, looking at certain city neighborhoods. So I think that the thing to focus on is, you know, not only where can the land bank use its home rule powers, eliminating title, eliminating tax, those types of things, but how do we really start to hone in on this intermediate use, which I think can increase the amount of rental housing out there, which I think does well for affordability, because at least, especially in parts of the north side of Chicago, there's much more demand for rental than there is purchase. There's a lot of communities with an enormous number of vacant homes, but either people can't get financing or there isn't the appetite for purchase right now. And I think we have to figure out a way to move those to rentals.
Thank you, Commissioner Gaynor. Anyone else want to weigh in on the affordability question?
Yes.
Scott?
Yeah, we'll go.
Go ahead. No, you first.
It's a really good question. We're doing some work in Logan Square, and obviously they've had concern for a long time about affordable housing preservation. So the way this tool might take place in a Logan Square might be very different than in other neighborhoods. So this could actually provide a tool for a for-profit or nonprofit developer providing permanent affordable housing and make that project more cost-effective to happen in the short term. You know, LS&A has been working for years to improve their schools, but if people get costs out of the housing, they're no longer going to Chicago public schools, and then all of a sudden the schools are under capacity. For reasons of the success of stable schools, very safe neighborhood, a place people want to live, but if you can't afford the housing, then the improvement in that schools doesn't help. So this is just one tool as part of a comprehensive picture of education, of safety, other issues.
I think it's important to acknowledge that we have made a public policy error in the last decade, in particular in focusing so much on home ownership, because we have a large number of people in our population, not just here in Cook County, but across the country, who shouldn't be homeowners, who don't really have the resources to maintain a home, particularly as times get difficult. And we've pushed home ownership on populations that can't afford it in the long term with devastating consequences. It's one of the contributing factors to the foreclosure crisis, along with predatory lending policies that particularly were focused on minority communities, African American, Latino communities. So I think we have to acknowledge that while homeownership is great and it's a way to have equity and to increase your wealth, there are large portions of our population that should be renters. That it's better for them in the long run. It provides more stable housing for them than trying to be homeowners, and that's I think that's a public policy tide that may have run out, this emphasis on homeownership, but we've really got to acknowledge that that's an error, and that we need to lift up rental housing.
Another example of where straight chalk is so needed. President Preckwinkle, I'm going to stick with you for a moment. There are a number of questions about the board, and I understand you may not be ready to talk about the specifics today, but people are just generally curious. I know that our report laid out and the ordinance confirmed a 13-member board. What can you share with the audience today about the process of board recruitment?
Actually, what we did is make known to the folks who were on our advisory committee that we were pursuing this, and tried to publicize it more broadly, and asked for nominations. And Herman might be able to speak to how exactly we whittled it down, but basically we said, you know, you all come, you nominate yourself or other people you think would be good members, and looked at the categories of folks that we wanted representative, advocates and realtors and banks and so on, and tried to be sure that we had a cross-section of folks who were actually involved in our advisory committee, those categories anyway, represented on the authority itself. But the good work was really done by Herman Brewer and Maria Choker-Urban and the staff in the Bureau of Economic Development.
Thank you. Scott, I'm going to ask you to kick us off on this one. Quite a few people also are curious, given the composition of Cook County being a significant portion city of Chicago, and then many other communities in suburban Cook County. What is the city of Chicago's stance towards this Cook County Land Bank? How might they participate? I know that they were involved with the technical assistance panel.
I thought you were going in a different direction with that question. We did talk to staff, we talked to aldermen, we talked to community groups in the city of Chicago, and most of the powers in the land bank already exist with the city of Chicago. That said, there was strong support for a number of reasons. Number one, it's very expensive. It's not really the mission of the city. The legal issues that you have to go through to acquire the type of property. The city also already owns a tremendous, the city and the sister agencies already own a tremendous amount of agencies. So there is a lot of potential for cooperation. I would say this is not just true for the city of Chicago, but we've heard very similar stories from many other municipalities in Cook County, that there was a lot of interest in partnering. It's very expensive to do these projects. Even if you're talking about environmental, holding things for that, there's still legal issues involved in that. So I don't know if it's just a city of Chicago issue. I think you also have it in the suburbs, that there's an interest in seeing what this land bank can do and how you could partner to move forward local priorities.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears, and this might be something that all of you want to weigh in on. We've got a lot of people curious because they might think about housing foreclosure and think about the reuse as housing redevelopment. But there's also literally dozens of questions here about urban agriculture, stormwater management, industrial development, adjacent neighbor use. How will the land bank sift through all of these possibilities, and how will people interested in those distinct uses work with the land bank in the future?
I think that's one of the great diversities of interest that dovetail with the clarity of purpose. So you have a lot of people interested in doing interesting and different things, but the land bank will funnel it all to how does it mitigate this issue of vacancy and foreclosure. So, I always love talking about the urban agriculture part because it's a lot more fun than talking about demo or these other things. But, there's actually someone in the audience who came to testify at the land bank ordinance hearing that has a farm in Wisconsin, the market is in Chicago, made the case that if there was arable land of, say, even 4 acres that they could use, it makes their product, you're eliminating 20 to 30% of the cost of their product, making it more profitable, making it less expensive, bringing it closer to the customer base. And I think the interesting thing when you think about intermediate uses, there are communities that have an immediate demand for housing, there are communities that have immediate demand for rental, and then there are some communities that may have a demand for development of some sort in the future, but it's not now. And how do you make sure that they're not going to live with a vacant lot or buildings that you can see through or other unattractive options for the next 2 years or 5 years or 10 years while that demand is building up? It could be that, especially in certain city communities, maybe you focus your development around transit or some other anchor, but there are still large tracts of land that won't really have a demand for kind of a built environment development for a while. And so I think that, at least on the agricultural piece, it's really interesting, it's exciting, it dovetails into everything that we're thinking about local foods and healthy eating and reducing the transport costs. So I think that while there are multiple uses and multiple options, as long as we take all of those things and funnel them through the prism of how does this address our issue of vacancy and foreclosure, then the diversity becomes a strength.
On this issue of urban farming, many of you know Will Allen. He was about an hour and a half away. There's a great article just written recently called "Don't Bet the Farm," and here are the numbers that stick in my mind. He has about $1.4 million a year in revenue, but his costs are $3.2 million. I view a lot of these lots in Cleveland and Northeast have gone to community gardens. They have a way of creating a sense of neighbor, and they bring people together. I'm not sure I understand how the urban farming idea is going to work in the long run. There is one model in Cleveland that's worth a visit if you're in Northeast Ohio. With some foundation support and new market tax credits, they've just built a 4-acre greenhouse, hydroponic, that is producing 3 million heads of lettuce a year, almost 10,000 a day, and 300,000 pounds of herbs. I understand that model. I think they will make money. In fact, they're producing, the lettuce is about 3% of the market in about a 100-mile area. But I understand that model. I've seen the numbers. I think that's sustainable. I just don't want to get too excited. And I love Will, and I've spent time with him, and he's been to Cleveland many times. I just don't know how long you can have those numbers work at cross purposes at 3.4 million, or 3.2 in cost, 1.4 in revenue. So I just want to be realistic about it. I am impressed by the effort in Detroit. They just dedicated 100 acres. They're doing 15,000. They're planting 15,000 hardwood trees. We've been part of an effort called Tree Pittsburgh, and we are working with local foundations to replant an urban forest on the thousands and thousands of vacant lots in Cleveland. And if you want to see an effort to take a lot of vacant space and really make creative reuse of it, you ought to visit Denver and look at Stapleton Airport. Different footprint, 4,700 square acres, but they set a third of that site, or about 30% aside for green space before they redevelop a single parcel. So where you have a lot of land, you've got more options. I don't think you have that kind of space here, though.
Any other comments about the various uses covered? Okay. Jim, can I follow up with you on another question? One of the index cards, or more than one, asked for you to elaborate on the EPA problem that you referenced, but also just in general, we know that vacant land is such an environmental drain on communities. How can we make sure that the land bank is a net positive from a green perspective? Are there ways to ensure recycled content, reuse of demo materials, et cetera? Are there some lessons that we can learn from Ohio?
Well, on the EPA issue, boy, more than you want to know. But let's start. In November of 2010,
the short version.
EPA, Region 5, issued a new ruling. Up until then, 1 through 4 family houses could be demolished without the more exhaustive EPA testing of each and every single property by drilling and looking for asbestos fibers in the horsehair, plasterboard. Basically, they had a much tougher requirement when you took down commercial buildings. They did not apply that to 1 through 4 family houses. They changed the rule. And all of a sudden, The requirement that they have in place now requires that every single property be tested. It's costly. There's a delay of 90 days. And we have learned that only 3.5% to 4% of the houses we take down is there that more significant problem. So we've imposed a 100% solution. We've tried to find a middle ground, been able to find it, and we're going to keep trying because, like I said, it's driven our costs up by 20 to 25%. We are working with people in Northeast Ohio that are doing recycling of demolition material. One company in particular recycles 90% of the material that comes through. Only 10% is landfill. We've worked with 2-3 companies that go in and disassemble houses board by board. One is called Peace of Cleveland. The other is trying to crank on the other plank. I'll get your information if you want. They use it for furniture. One of them just went in and took out 20,000 feet of a floor in an old stamping plant, and they've used it. And they're making butcher block tables, and you go around town and you see where some of the furniture, you know, have little plaques on it. But so we cooperate as much as we can, but make no mistake about it, deconstruction is very, very costly.
Yep.
And as much as we feel good about it, like that with urban farming, just know that if you're a deconstruct, you better expect to at least double your cost. And that's after 2 or 3 years of trial and error. Initially, it was 4 times more costly to deconstruct. But we viewed it as a possibility, a way of hiring the chronically unemployed felons who couldn't find work, and we still continue to look for ways to try to do that.
So this is an interesting question. We've all, I think each of you have commented about the need for this to be a partner to local communities. So as a follow-up, what can be done to ensure on an ongoing basis that the plans and priorities of local communities are respected and guide the decisions? How do we guard against the plan of a developer that might be inconsistent but financeable, jumping over that, and you know, kind of how do we ensure that this partnership is a true partnership of equals?
When I came in as president of Cook County, one of the things we did was create this Bureau of Economic Development, which hadn't existed before. We had a number of disparate departments that had a kind of piece of the action. And the instruction was that you are to work in cooperation with local communities, in partnership with them. Because we don't want our county economic development initiatives to be separate or apart from those. And actually, I see our goal and our obligation is to support local development efforts, not to create our own agenda. And in particular, we've been working in partnership with South Suburbs, South Suburban mayors and managers, and Southland Chamber of Commerce around things that they've kind of had bubbling for a long time. I just haven't had the resources to put it together. So our agenda in terms of the county has been based on the initiatives of local units of government. And I would anticipate that the Land Bank Authority is going to be the same. That is, people are going to focus on working with local units of government and not in contradiction to their plans and agendas.
Others?
I'll just make one. And as the president referenced earlier in her comments, there are 2 mayors on the board, and so I think that we'll make sure that the board kind of keeps that focus and that perspective front and center.
I'm a planner, so I got to weigh in on this one. You know, I think there's real opportunity both within neighborhoods and across municipalities. I agree, the South Suburbs have done an incredible job. You know, MPC's been working with the South Suburbs CNT for a decade or more now. It's now the SCJ, Dennis Morrison here, and others. It's hard to work across municipalities under the state of Illinois structure. We all know school districts and municipalities and counties, they're all separate and fragmented. But we also know that money goes to those areas that have their act together. And you can see that in the South Suburbs have been extremely successful, I think, over the past 5 to 10 years in terms of being able to tell their story and showing how that money is going to be leveraged and that people are working together that's going to lead to great things. I think you also see it within the city of Chicago, the New Communities program has done the same thing, whereas really nonprofits that in the past were competitive and a foundation would get 8 different proposals from different organizations in the same neighborhood. That doesn't happen anymore, or if it does, at least they know about it. I mean, there is joint planning and greater trust. It's hard work, But it is much more effective, and I think it's not a zero-sum game. More money goes to those areas that cooperate better.
So some practical, tactical questions. The board will be announced shortly. Funding needs to be sought, and then we've talked about the importance of the talent. So this is a very practical audience, so people have questions about who will be selecting the executive director, how that how that process of a selection of a team will happen, and if people are interested, how they would make that known, or if people are involved with land ownership or interested development in the hard-hit communities, how in the gear-up phase, what do they do while this land bank is getting organized? So people who want to participate in some way, either in the staffing or in the future development, what should they do?
First of all, Herman Brewer, Senator from Economic Development, and he will be here after the meeting, and you can talk to him. We will continue to support the Land Bank Authority with our own staff until such time as they have staff. So that's one way. But I think, to be fair, it's going to take us a while to gear up.
Yep.
So people need to be a little patient as we find good staff and focus on what our priorities are going to be and what partnerships are available, and kind of lay out the plan for the next decade. But I think for the next 6 months we're going to be focused on kind of internal issues of choosing staff and getting organized and so on.
Getting it right. I'm going to combine two questions here, partially perhaps for Jim and for Bridget. Are there powers that Ohio has that Cook County lacks that will impact the success of our land bank? And what steps are being taken by whom towards state foreclosure reform?
None that you can't correct. I mean, I don't know what your stream of revenue is going to be ongoing. You've already recognized that. You need money to make this work, right? So you can rely on foundations in the short term, but over time it'd be nice if you could institutionalize the way Michigan and Ohio have a steady stream of revenue that you can count on. A couple of things. One that I think you'd like to have is we have a safe harbor provision in the Ohio Land Bank law. We can take contaminated property, and as long as it comes in land bank, as long as we don't aggravate it, dig up the PCPs or whatever, we're not held liable, and it's a nice tool to have. Now, we'd like to have that with the federal folks, but we're fighting other fights with them now. But I think actually we've had really productive conversations that, you know, the reasons you want that, because nobody wants to have their name in that chain of title. So if you can bring it into a safe harbor, hold it while we find the money to clean up, and they can go out and find the money to do the deal, that's a good thing. I don't know, Commissioner, what else? I know the money, safe harbor, anything else?
There might be some small corrections or clarifications. I think ultimately we have to address some structural issues around tax sale. I've often referred to that as that which shall not be named, so we'll get to that later. But I think that for now we have a plan, and we'll execute on that plan. And I think, as I mentioned before, our first threshold task when this concept came to us was, can we execute on functions that are useful to our real estate economy without going to Springfield? The answer was yes. Could we get it better? Yeah, the answer is yes too, but I think we have enough to start.
Terrific. I'm going to make this the last question before our wrap-up. There are so many interesting people in the audience that I also want to give you a few minutes to network before we have to depart. So we've talked already in the Q&A session about the importance of this partnership, whether it be the City of Chicago with suburban communities, consistency with regional plans like CMAP's Go to 2040, councils of governments, and individual governmental-driven processes. What happens when there's not that capacity, when the communities haven't basically had the opportunity and the resources to get ahead of the curve and to look at, let's say it's a community that has had massive demolition, they are under-resourced in terms of green space, and the land bank clearly is an opportunity. There are community organizations that have expertise in addition to governments. So how can we help communities that haven't been able to be proactive in their prioritization for future development, and how do we incorporate community organizations in the work of the land bank?
Okay, well, the area of Cook County which has struggled the most for the longest period of time is the Southland. And they're blessed to have some of the best, the best organized efforts and a plan in place for their revitalization. So it's our south suburbs that have some of our poorest communities, but also has the South Suburban Mayors and Managers Association, which has a detailed plan for prospective redevelopment. So that's a blessing. In terms of community groups, I'm sure that we will be the subject of lobbying and advocacy by community groups around what our agenda ought to be and what our priorities ought to be, and we welcome that. But I think we're going to focus, frankly, on trying to work with units of government, because it's critical to those governments how land gets used and reused. So while I welcome the input of advocacy organizations and community groups, I think it's really units of government that the land bank authorities can have to work with most closely. Anybody else?
Any other comments on that? Terrific. You have been an. I want to start with the round leaders ourselves across our boards. People like Marty Stern and Pete Malachek are here today. We're very fortunate to have people like this very involved with the organization. We pledged to be part of this educational process moving forward. There were lots of questions I didn't get to. Hopefully we thematically got to many of the topical areas. But there's a thirst out there, and we'd like to be part of quenching that. So we will be hosting additional roundtables later in the year. Stay tuned. We will be in touch with you on this topic of land banks. And we will also be hosting events and discussions on other topics. Our next one that the Metropolitan Planning Council is hosting is on February 27th on anchor institutions and workforce housing solutions. So that is, if that's of interest, please join us for that one as well. We will make this available. This is available electronically. We have a few copies here of hard copy, and promise to stay in touch with you as these milestones move forward. We're really excited about working with each of you to be part of the solution. We cannot do it. We cannot become the best premier land bank in the country. We'll be the biggest. We want to be the best as well without your help. So thank you for giving us your noontime, and I hope you enjoy having a chance to network with each other, and thanks again to our panel.
Great job.